Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating and incredibly rich. And because we haven't got loads of time, I'm going to ask a few simple questions and then open it up, because I suspect there are people who want to ask you things that will be at least as coherent as what I'm going to ask. But I just want to talk a little bit about the theme that runs through it, particularly with yours, Mark, taking back control. I mean, you've done an economic analysis where the idea that anyone has any control is redundant. And I liked very much the idea that economics actually fits with culture. It's not a simple thing. No. So in my country, I was one of the few people who did predict Brexit because I got out of London a lot. Yeah. And as a consequence, it was stunning. We never met anyone we knew and loved who was voting Remain. Not our working class friends, not our middle class friends, not our arty friends. And when you said to them, why are you voting to leave? They said things like, enough is enough. And when you said you mean enough peace and prosperity since the Second World War, they'd look at you a little bit baffled. But there was a whole thing about a sense of it all galloping away and no one listening or being aware of what it was like to be on the receiving end. So for each of you, what do you think is the key, the most salient fact in the lack of control people have? Because it's clearly profound and, from what you've all argued, really quite really based. Do you want to start, Mark?
Sure. Little anecdata on this one. There's a guy called Anand Menon who was running around the country in Britain before Brexit saying, don't do it, don't do it. And he was giving a talk up north by Sunderland and Newcastle. And he was talking about how you would lose GDP. And someone from the audience shouted, your GDP. No, on the one hand it's ridiculous, right? But on the other hand, from a felt life experience, right? Yeah, you might generate GDP, but it all ends up in London.
Yeah.
Right? So what is this to me? I'm losing it anyway. Yeah. One way to think about Trump, right, and this is Nassim Taleb, so I'm going to credit him for this one. Trump is what happens when you eat McDonald's for 10 years. So why do we eat McDonald's when we travel on highways?
Because it's cheap.
No, because there's no downside to a McDonald's. It's very hard to get a bad McDonald's. It's always the safe choice. But if you eat it for a long time, then you get sick, right? And you get fed up of it and you wonder why it's the only thing on the menu. So think about this in politics. You're only being offered McDonald's. This is what political parties do. But you know that somewhere in the capital somebody's eating lobster thermidor. Or at least you hear about this. Yeah. And that generates those types of dissociations in terms of the way the economy is performing. And I think Peter's point's particularly important here, that when people want a decent job, they don't want more social protection. They want a decent job. A decent job and a decent wage is control over your life, control over your circumstances. And political parties have failed to do this. And one of the singular failures of the centre-left has been, we'll just give you more social protection. We don't want that. We want to take back control. And I think that's how that gets felt.
Yeah, and when you were talking, Peter, I thought of a very highly sentimental interview that was done on the New York Times podcast, which is normally very good, and this was toe curling. They even put sentimental music on it because they interviewed a real worker, a miner, I don't know if anyone else heard it, and who was actually dying of black lung. Incredibly interesting, thoughtful man. But the thing that stood out was when Peter Barari? I can't remember his name. He said, but Hillary was offering all these millions to make up for the loss of your jobs. And he just said, I don't want a handout. I want to work. And this misjudgment. Now, the brave reporter would have then said, but those jobs aren't ever really coming back. But he didn't. He backed off it. So I just wondered how you thought that the social, cultural, and economic pierces men in particular, because that's what struck me about your crafts.
Well, I think that the watchword here could be opportunity. And indeed, if there's any political force that's going to be capable of responding effectively to this populist resentment, it's probably going to be one that offers some kind of credible opportunity. If you look at the exit polls for Brexit in your country, you see that one of the questions that most separates those who voted to remain from those who voted to leave is a question about, do you think life will be better for your children or not? And in point of fact, those who voted to leave, of course, by something like 25% more, thought, no, life will be worse for my children than it is for me. Now, there is a a corollary to that, which is we're all very interested in the extent to which rising inequality lies behind populism. And I think in some broad sense it probably does. But I think the evidence is beginning to show us that what people care about is not how much Bill Gates is earning. They might care about the lobster thermidor. It sounds good to me. But what they really care about is their own life circumstances. Are those getting better? Can they expect them to get better or not? And so the economic fact that I think is important in many of these countries is not the rising incomes of the top 1%, it's the stagnating incomes at the median or below.
Do you think, as experts, we've all understood that enough? I was talking to someone who was chair of one of the big statistical organisations in the UK, and because the stats sort of suggested steadiness, I mean stagnation is another word for steadiness, there was an assumption that people were all right, and yet clearly there was this emotional turmoil going on underneath. I wondered, Erik, the extent to which your comparative studies will help us understand kind of how you even begin to address that emotional turmoil. We spent a whole day talking about a sense of us, and we started the day by saying a lot of it starts with emotion rather than rationality. This is a funny combination of rational external circumstances and the emotion that they generate, which can be different for different groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just coming back to something you said earlier and then connects to what Mark was saying, is that when I look at the kind of narrative that came out of reforms in this country, it was so disconnected from the reality that people were experiencing. I think it's that dissonance that really drove what we have seen later. And the other aspect that I didn't bring out, which comes out of the 2014 round of the Life in Transition survey, is that people no longer expect their children to have a better life than they did. And I think the combination of these two, this kind of fundamental disconnect and the sense that we are not going anywhere, and I think those together is what I see is the root of populism.
But it's interesting, it provokes anger, isn't it?
Yeah,
because we heard from somebody yesterday who talked about Palestinians in Israel, where because they have no hope of making any difference, they don't actually engage in confrontation. Palestinians in Palestine do, but in the Palestinian territories do. But the anger doesn't appear to, from all your analysis, to be something that we have robust enough institutions to deal with. I mean, is that what you are saying, effectively?
Well, I think Peter was saying, I think I really share that perspective, that at least if you look at Europe, I think the institutions in Western Europe have capacity to deal with it. I mean, it's not that we are not, we are in a very difficult point in time, I think, and certainly living in the UK, I think this is certainly true. But I don't face the same existential threat that we see in Eastern Europe. Well, look at what's happening in Hungary now. Look what's happening in Poland.
Romania.
These are, and where you can close down universities and with impunity. I mean, this is just.
But it's kind of they know all about that. They've done it for such a long time. This could turn out just to be a blip in those countries, couldn't it? This sort of democratic.
No, I think is a very dangerous.
No, I'm not arguing for it. I'm just saying.
But I think we should be careful because there were all kinds of kind of stereotypes of how these countries were and what their history was and so on. I think this things did fundamentally change. It's just that what was achieved turned out to be very fragile. I mean, we should recognize that these countries have had an economic and political development in a short space of time. I don't think we have seen anywhere before in history that when you have this combined political and economic transformation, they did achieve something remarkable, and now they're standing there fundamentally dissatisfied and with some sense of what did we get out of this?
Yeah.
It
is interesting what you say. It's a good corrective to me, because in Romania they've had public service broadcasting that defended democratic freedoms and independent journalism. It survived the Nazis, it survived the communists, and the current government is about to destroy it, which tells you a great deal about what's going on in those countries. But the institute, you said right, Peter, you said you were nervous about the institutions in the West, and they're going to be butted about, but you kind of suggested they were resilient. In my country, if you have no proper opposition, our system is built without a constitution on a kind of oppositional politics that keeps the checks of the government in place. If the middle ground does disappear, what happens to those kinds of institutions?
Well, I think the bigger threat none of us know, right?
Yeah.
And also, if Le Pen loses in May, we'll all breathe a big sigh of relief.
She'll come back.
If the Democrats retake the American Congress in 2 years, we'll all breathe a big sigh of relief. And there are ways in which we might be overinflating the current politics of the current juncture. But I think that the big threat in the West is really the collapse, and Mark referred to this, the collapse of existing political parties. Erik just mentioned that one of the weaknesses in East Central Europe is the weakness and fragmentation of political parties there. Well, we shouldn't look on that too smugly, because I think what we might well be seeing in the West is something very similar. And in the face of the social and economic challenges the world confronts at the moment, we need decisive governance. We need effective governance. Pierre Mendès France, the French Prime Minister, famously once said, "To govern is to choose." Well, highly fragmented coalition governments have great difficulty doing that. And it's there that I think in the Western countries, including this country, the real dangers lie.
And most of the European countries are built on coalitions. I mean, it's the nature of their representation
Yes.
one way or another, including Germany, actually.
If I can just jump in on this. The French election tells us, forthcoming French election is very interesting. So let's suppose that everyone breathes a sigh of relief. They're a family business. They're not going anywhere. They'll be back. But apropos what I was saying, let's assume this is structural rather than cyclical. This has been a long time in the making, and it's beginning to pop up now. So what we expect to happen in the second round is that everyone from the French Catholic right to the French communist left gets out of bed on a Sunday, links arms in arms, forgets the fact that they hate each other, and forms a giant blocking coalition to elect someone who used to be a banker. That's got Brexit written all over it as far as I'm concerned. So the turnout variable becomes critical. But let's suppose we get away with that. What we're doing is we're reducing democracy to a blocking coalition against the only people who have a positive vision for change. Now, you may not like the populist vision, but many people do. It's popular. And it says stuff is wrong, and this is what it is, and we need to fix it. And in a sense, we, the centrists, have lost the narrative. Because what exactly is our vision of the future? What exactly is the thing that's going to make life better for those coming after us? We can't deal with climate change. We can't deal with bickering amongst ourselves. We can't do anything with wage growth, income inequality. We don't know what happened to the economy. We bail ourselves out. Why should they have any faith in us? So unless we get our act together and say, actually, we understand what's going on, then this is going to be a permanent feature. And at some point, they're going to win something serious.
Views on that before we all jump off a cliff?
Or at least a call to arms.
Call to arms. That's not what academics do.
Scottish ones do.
I know they do. Any questions on this incredibly interesting, slightly anxiety-inducing subject? Yes. Could you tell us who you are?
Yes, Suman Berry. I'm associated with Bruegel in Europe. I wanted to go back to Peter and the focus on men, and to some extent the focus on manufacturing. A film that captured some of this angst was The Full Monty, which was about the feminization of work, the move to a service economy. So do we have any survey evidence on how women, who after all are a large part of the electorate, sort of participate in these populist movements?
We have some evidence on that. I mean, the evidence in general isn't very good because this is, as all the comments suggested, this is a dynamic movement, and what we've got is sort of cross-sectional surveys for the most part to look at it. And it's difficult to generalize, but across Europe, men tend to support populist parties more than women. That's far more true in some countries, say in the Brexit case, than it is in other countries, say in France, where the Front National is supported by women as well as men, and of course it's led by a woman, and also it assembles large numbers of young people who support the Front National in France in a way that we did not see in the Brexit case. So there are important national differences. I think that where, in many places where women are less supportive of populist parties, they're reacting against a machismo that is very evident in many of them, and in particular in this country. I think we should remember, though, that although the emphasis has been on the loss of manufacturing jobs, there are many kinds of jobs that are being lost, and a lot of people are unhappy because they have service sector jobs, but they don't have full-time work, or they don't have much security. They're on temporary contracts, moving into out of work. So the problem is far from a problem that has to do with the decline in manufacturing in the West, which has been going on for 60 years. It has to do with more general economic circumstances, and those affect women as much as they do men. I think, though, finally, if you look at, if you think back to my slide where we look at how do people's sense of their own social standing change over the last 30 years, I think the fact that women's sense of social standing has generally risen. In fact, it's declined among men and it's risen among women, and we see a convergence in many countries. In fact, I think all 14 countries that we look at. Well, a lot of that has to do with women moving into employment. So there's a way in which the lives of many women have become better over the last 30 years, at the same time as the lives and the traditional sense of their lives of men has declined. That doesn't produce a monolithic effect. It's not as if all the men in this room resent the fact that there are now women in this room. I rather enjoy it and would rather see more of them. But it does produce some effects. There's some evidence, it's very spotty evidence, but there is some evidence that low-educated white men resent the movement of women into occupations that are of higher standing and higher pay than their own. There is some evidence to that effect, especially in this country.
If I could just be permitted one follow-up. I mean, Bob Wright in the first Clinton administration drew attention to stagnating wages. So, I mean, is it too far-fetched to say that it was the capture of the Democrats by the Clinton regime that has got us where we are?
No, I don't. Well, my own view is that that would not be the case, but I will say one thing about that, which is, although I think it's reasonable to think that there's a Say's law of populism such that demand for it produces a supply, I think we should remember that support for populist candidates is not simply a bottom-up phenomenon generated by socioeconomic change. Like everything else in politics, it is to some extent manufactured from the top. And there are ways in which, and this of course renders the dynamic particularly complicated and also particularly worrisome, because there's a way in which once you've let that genie out of the bottle and produced a powerful message that many people come to accept about nationalism and anti-immigration and the like, that in turn generates further demand. So this is a case in which supply also is a component of the demand.
I mean, just to make the banal but important point that you've made, the clue is in the title. Populism is popular. It becomes popular, and it can be further kind of nurtured by those who choose to take that particular course. Thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting.